It is a question. It is a question that means we have to deal with the core of the life of the individual. I am one who supports the Church's position regarding annulment. It is part of the process by which the Church attempts as best she can to find a way to support the indissolubility of marriage, while at the same time recognizing the fact that there are people who do, for varying reasons, attempt to enter into a covenant agreement but are not capable of doing so at the time in which they do it. That's the annulment issue. The issue, head-on, of Joe Kennedy and his wife, former Mrs. Kennedy, certainly those issues are issues that are at the core of this debate, and that is the question of whether one or both of them was free to enter into a covenant. And certainly, as it was presented by, I might add, one of the most conservative tribunals in this country, it was found and determined that Joe Kennedy was not free to enter into a covenant agreement. It is not a question of whether or not one is free to enter into a contract, but rather whether or not one was of a mind and of an ability to engage in a process of making a commitment to another individual for a lifelong period of time before God and humanity. I don't find that we're granting an awful lot of unreasonable annulments in the Church today. The reality is that we haven't begun to uncover the number of peoples who, for a variety of reasons, entered into agreements with one another and were not free to do so. My best friend and also college roommate woke up one morning after being married for 5 years to a wonderful young man from the University of Dallas. Following the birth of her 2 children, simply left and did not return one day. And the reason was that she came from a very, very tight, restrictive family, and the marriage to this fine young man was one way to free herself and get out of the household of her parents. That is regarded as a textbook case of annulment. I have a roommate, a friend from high school, who married a fine young man. Everyone thought he would be great, just the catch of the town, only to discover many years later that he was sleeping with more of their former friends who were male than he was, in fact, with her. She did, in fact, seek and receive an annulment because he knew prior to his marriage that he was homosexual. It says nothing about being homosexual. It says whether or not we enter freely and honestly into an agreement before God to share our lives with another human being. That's the process of annulment. That there are many people who have probably, for a variety of reasons, married without knowing it, thought they engaged in a process of agreement and didn't, is a fact. It's a given reality. I think certainly those of us who are women recognize the variety of reasons why many women married and married unfreely. I recall my sophomore year of college as I dated this wondrous human being whom everyone expected someday we would be the talk of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, my hometown. And I can remember walking for 3.5 hours one evening and finally going to talk to one of my professors because I was certain that I was not prepared to make a lifelong commitment to this young man. Even though he was great, even though he was marvelous, even though we grew up from the cradle, but the fact of the matter was that everyone got married at 20 years old back in the 70s. Everyone tried to catch the best person around. My good fortune was that I was trained enough in theology to be able to reflect deeply enough to say, this is not for me, even if my parents did think it was a wonderful opportunity. And I broke the engagement. The question of annulment has to be separated from the question of birth legitimacy. Many of us as laity confuse what is in fact a legal, civil issue and an issue of inheritance with the issue of annulment. And it is part of what makes that issue so very, very difficult, so very questionable. There was a time in the life of the Roman Catholic Church where people of illegitimate birth were not allowed, in the case of priesthood, to rise above the rank of Monsignor, or in the case of religious life, to rise above the rank simply of being a member. What we have now arrived at, certainly in the revised Code of Canon Law promulgated in the early 80s, we've come to recognize that legitimacy is not a church issue. That is a civil issue. It is an issue of inheritance. When we look at the question of what does it mean for us to deal with marriage as we see it today and the problems, we have a complex society. One of the things the church has attempted to do to respond to the crisis of divorce and annulment is to extend the period of marriage preparation. During my tenure in Washington, I advocated for a 1-year period of preparation. In point of fact, the most we could get was 6 months. In this Archdiocese of Boston, it is a 6-month period, waiting period for preparing for marriage. And we have many organizations and groups that attempt to work with young people around that issue of matrimony. We also need to look at the question of how we are educating people. And I do believe that part of the reason we are seeing a rise in the number of requests for annulments is a sign of the fact that we are better educating the lay members of the church so that they can begin to look very realistically, and very soundly at who they are before the Lord and in relationship to their life partner. These are, in fact, issues that we must address. However, I must say very clearly that if the Second Vatican Council is, in fact, de facto illegal or somehow void, then we must say that all of the others were as well. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. We'll now move into the second phase of the debate, in which each member will have 5 minutes for a rebuttal.
To hear from the negative side of this discussion this evening was an explanation of the genuineness of the annulments, which are in the tens of thousands in this country. For handling of annulments, every diocese has a bureaucracy. Priests in the parishes find a great deal of their time taken with processing their part of the annulment process. We have heard nothing but verbiage this evening about the right of the church to make decisions which no one denies, which I do not deny. We have heard verbiage as to the fact that people at the time of their marriage are unfree to commit themselves to this state of life. How many people have attended a marriage and seen any force being exerted? Every marriage that I have had anything to do with has been a joyful occasion. There have been smiles on the faces of everyone, and the brightest smiles are to be found in the photographs which are taken after the event. The brightest smiles are on the faces of the bride and groom. This is what we expect. We have every reason to presume that the people who are exchanging vows know what marriage is, know what they're doing, and are freely entering into this relationship. I deny that they are proving that they are or were unfree. Most important is this commitment is not localized on the day of the